Do you know what's more terrifying than Halloween?
Midterms. But you guys are in luck because I happen to know all the things you'll be tested on. Actually, that doesn't help because I need you to know the things. Well, hopefully you can pay attention over the next several minutes as I go through some of this stuff. I would just like to add, if you want a better than decent shot at making an A on this exam, go back and watch my 2 previous videos over westward expansion and the Gilded Age. For a quick refresher, where to start? Ah yes, the Wild West. If I had to pick one thing that drove Americans west more than anything else, I'd have to say it was railroads. Yeah, we talked about the Homestead Act and other government land grants providing property to those eager to settle in the Great Plains, but as the rail tracks were laid, trains brought people west in droves. Speaking of railroads, remember who was responsible for building a great many of them? Chinese immigrants. As the railways were completed, however, those immigrants had to find other means of work. Some would become miners, laundry workers, or gardeners. This, of course, put a target on their backs among white Americans who felt the Chinese were stealing their job opportunities. Previously, we discussed this hatred for immigrants with another term, nativism. Nativists were seeking a purely white, English-speaking America and sought to expel anyone that didn't fit that profile. Thus, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which banned Chinese immigrants from entering the U.S. for about another 50 years. You'll remember, this wasn't the only racist piece of legislation that we discussed during this period. The Dawes Act broke up tribal lands and essentially forced Native Americans to assimilate and embrace American culture or face annihilation. So we've pretty much discussed all the important stuff happening on the West Coast. Now we're going to turn our attention towards the eastern United States. The main theme here is population explosion and its effects. First, we have a rise in useful commodities and new technologies that result in factories popping up all over the eastern seaboard and parts of the Midwest. What do factories need? Workers. The domestic population of the U.S. couldn't quite meet the labor demands of the time period, which led to an influx of European immigrants, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many of these immigrants were looking for factory work, but plenty were leaving their homeland due to poverty, starvation, and religious or political persecution. Take the Irish, for example. My great-great-grandfather came to the United States in part because of the potato famine and because his religion wasn't readily accepted in some parts of Ireland. But when he arrived here, he didn't find a welcoming crowd. People were hostile towards him because of his Irish roots. He changed the family name from McPhee to Fee to better fit in. Speaking of fitting in, many immigrants found it more comfortable to settle in communities with similar immigrants. This is why you will find an abundance of Catholic churches in close proximity to historically Irish communities and places like Boston. For some reason that I cannot explain, American Protestants and Roman Catholics really didn't get along. I mean, they both have Jesus, so what's the problem? This period of rapid urban growth or urbanization led to a number of issues faced by the population of these cities. Places like New York City grew so fast, it was hard for the government to keep up and provide basic services like waste disposal, sanitation, and other improvements to urban infrastructure. Enter the corrupt politicians of Tammany Hall seeking wealth and power. Guys like Boss Tweed provided hospitals, housing, urban development projects, and more in exchange for votes from citizens. He specifically preyed on those immigrants that I spoke of earlier. Since we're on the topic of corruption, let's shift from the political to the corporate variety. As factories and business opportunities expanded, so did the wealth and power of business owners. Guys like J.D. Rockefeller merged competitors in the oil business to form a trust, which gave him a monopoly on oil prices. Decreased competition in the marketplace meant Rockefeller could charge whatever price he wanted for a barrel of oil. The government ignored much of this market manipulation at first because the politicians were bought and paid for. This level of greed and corruption is why we call it the Gilded Age. A select few individuals became very wealthy while others remained poor and at the mercy of their employers. If you were an average factory worker during this period, you worked excessively long hours for very little pay and had no opportunity for recourse, at least until workers began forming labor unions. With every labor union member gained, workers gained better pay and conditions. We've only discussed domestic elements of American history up until this point, and that's for good reason. Until the turn of the 20th century, the United States had a policy of minding its own business. That all began to change with the beginning of the Spanish-American War. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'll save most of this material for a separate video while still providing what you need for your midterm exam. Basically, there are reports of human rights abuses in Cuba, which is governed by Spain. There is also American economic interest in Cuba because of their production of sugarcane. Also keep in mind that Cuba is in close proximity to the United States. To top it off, an American naval vessel, the USS Maine, mysteriously blows up in Cuba's Havana Harbor. Initial stories indicate the Spanish government may have been responsible for the explosion. Were they? Probably not. Historians agree that more than likely there was a fire on the ship and it spread to the ammunition stockpiles aboard. But it didn't matter. Newspapers ran with the "Spain is to blame" headline because they thought it would sell well. They were right, and the US went to war. Long story short, the Spanish lose. They give Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the US. Cuba is free, and the US is finally recognized as one of the big boys because, well, they defeated one of the big boys. Another consequence of this is that the US sees their resources and overseas markets expand. Not every American is thrilled by this news, however, because they feel the US has now become an imperial power, too large to defend, which they believe will inevitably lead to more international conflict. That's pretty prophetic, don't you think? That's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video gives you the confidence that you need to pass your midterm exam. And I'll see you in class.